All right. So today I'm going to talk about bandhas, and core support, essentially. They are, to a degree, one and the same. And we often talk about core support, but or give lip service to it in a class. We say engage the core, but we don't always tell people what that means and how to do it. And when I first started doing yoga, when I was 21 years old, that was a long time ago, and I did not know what the core was. My teacher at the time, um, my teacher at the time, they they said to engage the core when we were doing something in class, but they didn't tell us how. And so that was my first introduction to the core in the sense of the word, of the phrase. And understand this was back in the mid mid 90s. So yeah, core support wasn't on the radar for the average person. So when my teacher in class in the mid 90s said, engage the core, I didn't know what they were talking about. And I hear a lot of yoga teachers do the same. Probably, personal trainers and fitness teachers as well, instructors. And I often wonder if there are people in the room who don't know what it means to engage the core, just like I didn't know what it meant. So this session is twofold. I'm talking about the bandhas, and I'm also talking about um, the concept of engaging the core. Now, the bandhas are a little bit more than a physical entity. The bandhas, specifically in this case, I'm talking about Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha. Mula means root, Bandha means lock. I like to think of the lock, the bandha, as a valve, so we can engage it a little bit or we can engage it a lot. And I think that that's a more refined topic that we can go into another time. I'm not going to talk too much about the details of you know, which postures do we need to engage the core a lot or engage the bandhas a lot, and so on and so forth. And you can more or less figure that out yourself. If you feel like you need more support, engage the bandhas more. If you feel like you need less support, engage them less. But then another sort of side topic is the topic of conditioning these muscles and bandhas, valves, Mula Bandha, root lock, Uddiyana Bandha, upward flying lock, conditioning them to engage as we need them and to the degree we need them. And so, this is something that you could run a workshop on once you understand it deeply yourself in your own body and in your own practice. You could probably run easily an 8-week, once a week, 2-hour class workshop on using the bandhas effectively in your yoga practice. So I told the story about how when I first did yoga in my first yoga sessions, when I was 21, long time ago, that the teacher said, engage your core. And I didn't know what that meant. When I finally understood what it meant and wanted to bring it into my yoga practice consciously, when I understood not just the core, but the bandhas, and the value of paying attention to the bandhas, I did a little practice with myself. I made my own personal practice within my yoga practice that had to do with the bandhas. So at the time, I was studying with who I consider to be my greatest yoga teacher, um, along with Dr. Ladd, but my greatest asana teacher. So my greatest asana teacher, who's called Swan, I was doing a class, and I regular class 2 hours a week every week, and I decided that what I was going to do was, before I moved to the next asana, I was always going to make sure that my bandhas, Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, specifically my pelvic floor muscles and my abdominal muscles, were engaged to the degree I needed them before transitioning to the next posture. So I can't move until I engage my bandhas. This is one of the practices that I initiated within my own yoga practice to start to condition my body to engage these muscles and bring awareness to the greater concept of the bandhas in my own yoga practice. So I can't move until the bandhas are adequately engaged for the movement I'm about to do, the transition, and for the asana that I'm going into after that. And so, in a sense, the bandhas became the focus of my practice. By that time, I was familiar enough with the sequences and asanas in the classes that I didn't have to think too much about those things. I knew where I was going next because we were doing, set sequences, and I knew how to do the asana. I felt confident in the asanas. So the next step was then bandhas. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't focus on bandhas first or at the same time as you're, in a brand new class and you don't necessarily know what asanas are going to be done and you don't necessarily know what the sequence is going to be like. But it is difficult to focus on too many things at once. That said, we don't really want to be practicing without core support. So that's a little bit about my own journey with bandhas. What I want to talk about now is I want to talk about the bandhas themselves, the core muscles themselves, how things differ from bodies with uteruses to bodies with penises, and the difference in the perineum and the perineal area, and the differences in the muscles that are engaging to engage Mula Bandha. I want to talk about a little bit about how the tradition of yoga may not necessarily cater as much to people with uteruses because it mostly was not traditionally people with uteruses. So let's dive into that first. So when I was first learning yoga, which was a long time ago, I took my first classes in 1995. In the early years of my yoga practice, the words and phrases that were used to describe engaging Mula Bandha were saying things like contract or engage Ashvini Mudra. And Ashvini Mudra is the rectal sphincter. So the rectal sphincter will engage also the muscles sort of to the posterior of the perineal area. And if you are a person with a penis, then it's going to engage quite a lot of the muscles in that area because the perineal area is it's a little bit different from one sex to another. So that's a great cue for those who were born with penises, but it may not be a great cue for those who are born with uteruses and have vaginas and have vaginal muscles and vaginal walls full of vaginal muscles. So really those areas are so different depending on the reproductive organs that you were born with, and also depending if they've been altered or changed now. But for those of us that were born with a vagina and a uterus and a cervix, there's a lot of musculature there that's involved with Mula Bandha. And I can't speak for those without vaginas and uteruses because I don't know what it feels like to engage those muscles. But my understanding from talking with people is that engaging Ashvini Mudra, the rectal sphincter, is a great way for those born with penises to engage Mula Bandha, but it's not maybe the only way or even necessarily the best way to describe engaging for those of us that were born with uteruses. So what I usually say is engage the muscles that stop a flow of urine, because I think that helps no matter which reproductive organs you were born with. That's going to help you find the muscles required to find that Mula Bandha area and support. And now Mula Bandha is not just a physical area or action, it's also energetic. It is said that we lose energy, we lose prana, and it is said that those of us who were born with a uterus lose prana even more because there are more openings, more ways to lose prana out that direction. So it's also an energetic support. right? So you can play with it, and encourage your students to play with it in their day-to-day life in totally normal settings, because nobody knows if you're playing around with the way that you can find a little bit or a little bit more or a lot of support in Mula Bandha. So when I was first learning about my Mula Bandha area, I'll tell you a really intimate thing. Hopefully it's not TMI, but I had a history of constipation. And because of that, the idea of engaging Ashwini Mudra, which is the rectal sphincter, wasn't comfortable for me. I already had a lot of trouble relaxing that area and having healthy bowel movements. So it was unpleasant and unattractive for me to be squeezing my rectal sphincter. So when I discovered that rather I could use the muscles that stop a flow of urine, focus on those, and that in my body, I could use the muscles of the vaginal wall to support myself in engaging Mula Bandha, and that also I could engage it a teeny tiny bit. If you're listening now, just try it now. Whatever reproductive organs you have, try it now. Just try oh, just the tiniest bit of engagement. Like, oh, I think I have to pee. No, I don't. And then relax. Oh, do I have to pee? Oh, but there's nowhere to go. I have to find a washroom. Uh-oh, I have to pee. And then get it a little bit more engaged, more engaged, more engaged. So there's like lots of levels. And those who have maybe given birth might have a lot more intimacy with that area in their body, and might have practiced those various levels of engagement that make this area more like a valve than like a lock. Because a lock suggests it's kind of like locked or unlocked. But what I want to suggest is that when we really get excited and curious about Mula Bandha specifically at first, then we can really engage like 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. And so you're sitting on the bus, you're riding your bike, you're standing in line, waiting to pay for something, you're in your vehicle, you're sitting at dinner. You know, there's so many times in our day when we could be curiously bringing awareness to that area in our body and exploring what it feels like to engage it a little bit more, a lot, and then to also slowly relax it. So that's a little bit about how to bring curiosity about Mula Bandha into your days. Practices for you to do yourself to become really intimate with that area in your own body. And then practices that you can bring into your yoga classes and suggest to your students to take into their day. So that's a little bit about Mula Bandha. And that's a little bit about how the anatomy of that area is different depending on which reproductive organs you were born with. And the anatomy of that area changes as well, a little bit depending on if you've had some reproductive organs altered or removed. And so we want to bring a curiosity, and we want to think about the area being more like a valve than a lock. And then we want to bring practices and a playful, friendly, curious eye to that area in our bodies from day to day, and just see if we can bring some regular practices into our life to become more and more familiar with that area. And then I think it's always good to keep an element of humility so that we recognize and appreciate that we don't know what that area feels like for someone born with different reproductive organs. And so they might need different cues. And then also if people have had reproductive organs removed or altered, that area might feel different. And we also want to bring a big, good, healthy helping of consideration to the possibility that that is an area where people may have experienced trauma. I didn't experience trauma in that area, but I experienced discomfort and some mild stress around the discomforts that I had in that part of my body as a young person growing up who didn't have healthy bowel movements. And I had some shame and embarrassment around the amount of time I sometimes had to spend in the bathroom and that kind of thing. And that was all associated with that area of my body too. So we want to bring also a helping of respect, empathy, and compassion for the possibility that that people might have a little bit of a stressful history with that area, or even a traumatic history with that area. So let's remember that too when we're teaching, and try to give space for people in our classes to forego attention on that area if that's not something that they want to put their attention on at that time. So Uddiyana Bandha, upward flying lock. Uddiyana Bandha is more about the abdominal area. And ideally, we want to use all of these muscles to support ourselves in our asana practice and as needed, as necessary in our pranayama practice. And so Uddiyana Bandha, Uddiyana, upward flying, it's called that because when you really strongly contract the abdominal muscles, it feels like they are moving up in the body, back and up. Try it now with me. Now, I've eaten too recently, and so it's not a great time for me to be strongly contracting the abdominal muscles in that way. And this is another thing to remember, is that especially when it comes to Uddiyana Bandha or pranayama practices that require the engagement of Uddiyana Bandha or the abdominals, we don't necessarily, we want to remember that there are some contraindications for engaging these muscles. So there aren't really so many contraindications for Mula Bandha. We wouldn't want to do, however, strong pranayama practices engaging Mula Bandha and or Uddiyana Bandha during menstruation, during pregnancy, with recent abdominal surgery of any kind, recent hernia. Yeah, and then strong breathing practices, once we get into there's some more contraindications such as unmedicated high blood pressure. And, any other kind of recent internal surgery, anything on the eyes, because if we're creating pressure up in the head area and that kind of thing. But the really important ones are no strong abdominal thrusting using the bandhas and so on during menstruation or pregnancy or recent hernia or abdominal surgery. So, Uddiyana Bandha, upward flying lock. So, when I describe this one, I describe it as drawing the navel toward the spine. Now, if we want to talk a little bit more about the physical sort of Western perspective on this bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, we want to think about the fact that there are different sets of abdominal muscles. And I find that the ones that are hardest for people to engage are the lower abdominal muscles. So if you're very interested in this topic and you're very interested in supporting your students, or even for yourself in developing more awareness in this area, you could take a hand and place it under the navel when you do these practices. And you could feel into the abdominal muscles that are lower down, the lower abdominal area. Uddiyana Bandha, we often think of the area navel and above. And that area is a little bit easier to connect with, I find. And so you could even place a hand above and below the abdominals and get curious about what's happening in both areas when you are engaging Uddiyana Bandha. Another tip that you can use in your yoga practice or can offer your students in your yoga practice in terms of how to start to use these bandhas more consciously in your own yoga practice and support your students in doing so is to put a hand on the area. So what I like to do, especially in postures that require a lot of support there, is to put hands on the belly above and or below the navel. So for example, that might look like getting your students prepared for a warrior 3 and having the students bring their hands to their abdomen and as such to get feedback about what's happening in the abdominal area during that posture, and always working from that area outward. So it's very common in challenging postures such as Warrior Three or Half Moon to really stretch out, and then the center collapses. And so what we can do is we can encourage our students to bring their hands into their abdominal area above and below the navel, and then to keep the back leg in Warrior Three bent until they feel engaged in Uddiyana Bandha and Mula Bandha. And then they can start to extend the back knee into their Warrior Three posture while continually remaining aware of the support in the abdominal area. And as soon as they lose the support in the abdominal area, they bend that back knee, they bend their standing leg knee, and they come back into a gentler version of Warrior Three until they re-engage the bandhas, and then again start to expand out from that connected core area. So moving from the core outwards is something that I've been working with for a long time in my own personal practice, and which I like to support my students with. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of doing this in the context of, say, a drop-in yoga class where you have students who are new and you maybe don't know them, and you maybe worry about, spending too much time on cueing and not enough time in postures. And these are all natural concerns and concerns that I've had. However, I'll say that awareness of and effective use of core support in the pelvic floor and abdominals, in Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, can be so transformative for a person's experience in their yoga practice that it is worth spending time on. What you might do is you might say at the very beginning of class, you might talk about it while you're in your centering posture. And so you might talk about gentle awareness of Mula Bandha, and then start to use a little bit of contraction and relaxation of Mula Bandha along with the in and out breath. It doesn't matter necessarily whether you contract on inhalation or exhalation, both can feel good. You can even invite people to contract Mula Bandha on whichever part of the breath feels good, and even try it both ways to see what feels best for them that day, because it might change. You can think about how you can work awareness of Uddiyana Bandha into, let's say, your description of Ujjayi breath. So often I would talk about Mula Bandha at the beginning of a class while seated, and a little bit of awareness of it while doing maybe a seated cat-cow. And so it might sound something like this. As you exhale, squeeze the pelvic floor muscles like stopping a flow of urine. As you inhale, relax those same muscles. Now, as you exhale, round the back, engaging Mula Bandha. As you inhale, open the chest, relaxing Mula Bandha. So first starting with breath awareness, with Mula Bandha engagement, and then moving into a cue for movement that also includes awareness of Mula Bandha and the breath. For Uddiyana Bandha, I would often talk about Uddiyana Bandha once we're in our first Tadasana, once we're in our first standing posture. And so that might sound like standing at the top of the mat, eyes open or closed, become aware of the support of Mula Bandha, just a little bit of support to help us with standing in our Tadasana, mountain pose. And as you exhale, start to draw the navel toward the spine, the areas above and below, perhaps placing your hands there. And now constricting the throat like when you whisper, for Ujjayi breath, continuing to gently engage Uddiyana Bandha while breathing in and out through the constriction of the throat, into the chest, into the upper back. This starts to feel a little bit different from our usual breathing practices because we find that as we inhale, we're drawing the belly in and the chest expands. Still a little bit of support in Mula Bandha. Continuing to support in Uddiyana Bandha, even as we exhale, maybe Mula Bandha gets stronger. Maybe Mula Bandha squeezes a little bit more as we let the breath out. So taking 5 to 10 breaths in your Tadasana mountain pose to start to use Uddiyana Bandha, and then combining it with Ujjayi breath, and then combining it all together, awareness of the core, your pelvic floor muscles all engaging together, and the pelvic floor muscles being part of the core muscle support, and then noticing how that supports Ujjayi breath, expanding the chest and upper back with breath through the constriction in the throat. So that's usually how I would bring these into just about every class, bring this awareness into just about every class. And we really, in order to teach a safe class, we really have to make sure that we don't just say engage your core or engage Mula Bandha or Uddiyana Bandha. We need to teach the students how, right? Because so many don't know how, because we're not born with awareness of how to use our core. Or maybe we are, because we see the way that little babies move and it looks like they're much more core aware. But that's also, our spine curves change as we bring our head up and then as we stand up. And when we get those spinal curves and we no longer have just a C curve, then the core probably doesn't, engage as easily. I don't know the embryology or the developmental changes that happen in the neuromuscular awareness of the core. I've never looked at research in that. But what I do know anecdotally through the decades of my life and my experience with yoga is that most people don't have bodies where the core engages without bringing conscious awareness to the area and doing so intentionally. I think the exception is if someone has done a sport or activity as a young person that has conditioned their body to engage the core, and then that body probably, like any muscle memory, even if they stop doing gymnastics or playing soccer or whatever else they might have done that conditioned their core as a young person, even if they stop doing that, say through their teen years or their 20s, and then they come to yoga in their 30s, probably the core is still going to engage as it's needed in the asana practice, maybe not in the pranayama practice if the person doesn't understand when and how to use the core in the pranayama practice. So there is an exception group, probably a minority of people, where the core has been conditioned to support when it's needed in physical movements that require a lot of muscular support. But for those of us who didn't have a youth where our core was conditioned to support us in a particular physical activity, someone just saying engage your core is not going to be helpful. And it's going to be even less helpful if they say engage Mula Bandha and I don't know what that is, or Uddiyana Bandha and I don't know what that is. So remember to say Mula Bandha, pelvic floor support, like when you stop a flow of urine. Uddiyana Bandha, abdominal support, drawing the navel toward the spine. So that's a quick little sharing on my path with the bandhas and core support, my use of it as a teacher in classes, and then my support of students in using it for themselves. And it's a continued journey. I found that over the last few years, because of the pandemic and not doing yoga as much, in fact, during that time, that I've lost some of that support that I had there. And as soon as I bring it back, it feels so much better, especially in terms of supporting my back. Now, there's not necessarily evidence-based research to suggest that strengthening the core supports the back definitively, but that is my experience of it. So I hope that some of that was helpful to you. I hope that my sound was good throughout. And I hope that you have a nourishing day.